Madam President, last week the Senate confirmed President Trump's 150th judge. That's a significant milestone and one that's been harder to achieve than it would normally be, thanks to Democrats' determination to delay judicial nominations. Again and again, Democrats have used the time-consuming cloture vote process to delay confirmation of President Trump's nominees, even nominees that they ultimately chose to vote for. By this point in President Obama's first term, Republicans had required cloture votes on just 3 of President Obama's judicial nominees. 3. Compare that to today. As of September the 12th, Democrats had required cloture votes on a staggering 71.7% of President Trump's picks for the bench. 71%. Basically more than 2 out of every 3 judges, Madam President, the Democrats are requiring cloture votes. And by that simply means they're filibustering that particular nominee. The way that you end a filibuster is you have to invoke cloture. When Republicans were in the minority, when President Obama was in the White House, at this point in President Obama's first term, the Democrat at that time majority had to invoke cloture just 3 times for 3 judges that Republicans had tried to block. But as I said, right now, same point in President Trump's first term, we're talking about almost 72% of every judge, all the nominations combined have been filibustered. So if you think about that and you add it up totally cumulatively, it's about 100 now compared to 3 during President Obama's first term, same time in office. As I've said, Madam President, many of these are nominees that Democrats went on ultimately to vote to confirm. In other words, it's not that President Trump has nominated scores of extreme nominees whom Democrats felt they couldn't support. Again and again, Democrats have delayed a nominee, then turned around and voted in favor of him or her. In one particularly memorable example, in January of 2018, Democrats forced the Senate to spend more than a week considering 4 district court judges, even though not one single Democrat voted against their confirmation. Not one single Democrat. These judges could have been confirmed in a matter of minutes by voice votes. Instead, Democrats forced the Senate to spend more than a week on their consideration, time that could have been spent on genuinely controversial nominees or on some of the many important issues that are facing our country. This September, the Senate has confirmed 6 district court judges. Democrats forced cloture votes on 4 of them, despite the fact that all 4 were eventually confirmed by huge bipartisan margins. In fact, one was confirmed by a unanimous vote of 94-0. Now, Madam President, if Democrats had a serious reason for their obstruction of the President's judicial nominees, they would not be repeatedly turning around and voting for them. Their obstruction isn't based on principle, it's based on partisanship. They don't like this President, so they're obstructing his nominees even when they agree that they're well qualified for their positions. As a result, we're forced to spend hours upon hours of Senate floor time on uncontroversial nominations, time we could be using for other priorities. And Democrat delays are not helping the judicial vacancy rate, which is still high despite Republican efforts to get judges confirmed. High numbers of vacancies result in long waits to get cases heard, which serves nobody. But, Madam President, while Democrat obstruction is bad enough, unfortunately, we've had a lot more to worry about. In recent months, Democrats have moved beyond obstruction and into directly threatening the independence of the judiciary. Court packing, an idea which pretty much everybody thought had been consigned to the dustbin of history almost a century ago, is enjoying a revival among members of the Democrat Party. For anyone who needs a refresher on this concept, the theory of court packing is quite simple. If the Supreme Court is not deciding cases to your liking, add more judges to the court until you start getting the decisions that you want. It's not hard to see why this is a terrible idea, but that hasn't stopped it from gaining traction in the Democrat Party. In fact, 5 prominent Democrats, including a Democrat presidential candidate and the second-ranking Democrat in the Senate, recently filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court threatening the court if it failed to rule according to Democrats' preference. The Supreme Court is not well, they said, and the people know it. Perhaps the court can heal itself before the public demands it be restructured in order to reduce the influence of politics, end quote. Translation, if you don't rule the way that we want you to, you won't like the consequences. Madam President, threatening members of the judiciary is the domain of dictators and despots, not members of the United States Congress. And it is deeply disturbing that prominent Democrats now apparently see nothing wrong with trying to intimidate the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, it's becoming apparent that there are few lengths to which Democrats will not go in their increasingly desperate partisanship. Just this week, we saw Democrats leap on the opportunity to drag Justice Kavanaugh's name through the mud yet again, based on yet another vague and unsubstantiated rumor. More than one Democrat presidential candidate instantly cried that he should be impeached. And what was their basis for such a drastic suggestion? A New York Times article that was, as the leader pointed out, so short on reporting that it ran on the opinion page of the New York Times instead of in the news section. Not to mention that after running this piece, the Times quickly had to issue a correction, noting a glaring omission in the original story. What was the omission? The fact that the supposed victim of Justice Kavanaugh's supposed behavior declined to be interviewed, and that her friend said she had no memory of the alleged incident. It's not hard to see what's behind Democrats' relentless campaign to smear Justice Kavanaugh's name. They are furious that it was a Republican and not a Democrat president who got the opportunity to choose a justice to replace a perceived swing vote on the Supreme Court. And they're afraid that Justice Kavanaugh won't issue the rulings that they want. And here we get to the heart of the problem with Democrats' increasingly unhinged leftism and attacks on the judiciary. Democrats aren't looking for judges or a judiciary that will rule according to the law. They're looking for a judiciary that will rule in accordance with Democrats' preferred policies, whether they have anything to do with the law or not. And that, Madam President, is a very dangerous goal. Sure, it might seem nice when an activist judge who shares your political opinions reaches outside the meaning of the statute and rules for your preferred outcome. But what happens when that same judge reaches beyond the law to your detriment? What protection do you have if the judge and not the law becomes the highest authority? The only way to ensure the protection of individual rights is to ensure the rule of law. And that means having judges who will make decisions according to the law, not according to their personal preferences or the principles of a particular political party. In the wake of Democrats' threat to the Supreme Court, all 53 Republican senators sent a letter to the justices underscoring our commitment to protecting the independence of the judiciary. As we noted in the letter, and I quote from it, "There is no greater example of the genius of our Constitution than its creation of an independent judiciary. Time and again, our independent federal courts have protected the constitutional rights of Americans from government overreach, even when that overreach was politically popular," end quote. Madam President, if we want our courts to continue protecting Americans' constitutional rights, then we need to ensure that they remain independent. Democrats' interests in having judges who will rule according to their preferred outcomes is not new. But in the past, their interest has not led them to attempt to bully judges into voting their way. I hope, Madam President, Democrats will think better of their repressive tactics before our independent judiciary becomes the victim of their political agenda.